What do men want? A simple enough question, but given the context, shall we not ask, what do women want? How do men want things? What is this collective situation of hostility between the genders, of indifference even, that we find ourselves in? What characterizes it? How have we found ourselves in a situation in which the relations between each other are more frail and fragile and imploded more than ever before? Nina Power, in her new book, What Men Want, dares to explore these questions and more. Together we talk about the character of modern relationships between men and women, the incel and femcel questions, what characterizes the profound loss and ennui and purposelessness of our modern age, and how can we come to an agreement between the sexes when it comes to addressing these deeper issues. Join us on what is, to me, one of the best podcasts on content minded thus far. Nina Power is a tour de force of intellect, of wisdom, and insight. All right, so this is exciting for me because I've wanted to do this for a long time with you. So the lovely, amazing, intelligent Nina Power has humbly graced the absolute dregs of far right. No, I'm kidding. Oh man, oh boy. No, but this is great. Yeah. So don't worry about I'll do like an intro beforehand because I usually don't pretending there's an audience is kind of stupid, but but yeah. Yeah. So I have been fastidiously reading your work for a long time, and I recently gunned through what do men want, and as a man, I don't even know what I want myself. But
no. Nobody does.
Nobody does. But so you don't need an introduction, but I guess a good question to start off with would be what motivated you to write? Well, I want to get into more theory cell stuff, like a lot of ideas I have, but what motivated you to write What Do Men Want, and how is it different from your previous work? I mean, in some ways, your previous work, One-Dimensional Woman, it's great, but it is kind of like a time capsule of the 2000s. But what would be the qualitative difference between what you were doing in One-Dimensional Woman? Because I do notice a lot of similar themes between that and What Do Men Want, like in terms of the commodification of all life and our own unique, let's say, species being subject to this pervasive and predatory forms of like commodification, but I would also say like mutual panopticism in a lot of different ways. Like, for example, pornography is like a strong theme in like both of them. But how are they different though? Like, how is the woman question different than the man question?
Well, Gio, let me tell you, you may have noticed that in the intervening period between 2009 and 2022, or whatever goddamn year of empire we are currently in, the vast portions of the so-called left decided to go completely batshit crazy, and whatever value there is in some of the anti-capitalist critique, which I still maintain, or some of the 60s and 70s work, particularly around consumerism, and I'm a big fan of Ivan Illich and various thinkers who aren't, or R.D. Lang, who are not kind of easily placeable, or Lash would be a more obvious character, but in a sense that these people were sort of genuinely thinking about these problems as problems for humanity en masse, rather than as partisan positions of left or right. And obviously there's a right-wing anti-capitalism as well,
That's the scary kind.
But I mean, which is also worth thinking about when we're talking about nature and the environment and order, right. And so I mean, at this point, I don't, it doesn't matter to me particularly where I get my inspiration, in the sense that I think one of the main problems is this partisan politics that is just sort of like eroded people's brains. The idea that we can't take interesting ideas from people that we might otherwise disagree with. I mean, it's like, there's resources in Nietzsche, there's resources in Spengler, there's like whoever. I mean, just as there are resources in Marcuse or wherever. So yeah, I think I was kind of motivated to try to respond in a calm and reasonable way, insofar as that's possible, to some of the madness, just because it just isn't true fundamentally. This is not, this is not how men and women relate, and this is not how men are, and this kind of deranged, divisive, as you say, the level of species being this, this culture which seems to get off on creating these kind of false divisions, which are very handy if you're trying to stop people looking at what's really going on, whether it's economically, politically, geopolitically, who actually has the power, who are the elites, and so on. I mean, you don't have to be a grade A weapons grade conspiracy theorist to think that there's like some problem with identity politics or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I wanted to maintain some ground, which is to do with like the reality of the existence of men and women, and whether we think of that as a biological fact or a religious fact or a social fact or whatever. The important thing is maintaining this question of difference. I think the recognition,
right.
And difference is what is being chewed up by this kind of grotesque machine, whether it's bureaucracy, whether it's institutions, and actually, paradoxically, I think the elimination of difference is actually what fascism is. Like, if you want a definition of fascism in the kind of as a totalitarian principle, it's homogeneity. It's the absolute elimination of difference, whether that's or otherwise. It's not the acceptance, and then we have the kind of forced teaming, being ideologically, at a gunpoint, diversity is our strength shit, which isn't about difference.
Yeah, well, I come from the country where that's the state ideology. So
right. I mean, but it's kind of everywhere in the West. I mean, I know Canada is particularly bad, but yeah, I mean, it's insane. Like, I turned on the radio yesterday and I felt like I was in like dystopian nightmare, because everything is and it doesn't help people who are gay. It doesn't help people who are like, I don't know, whatever, different in some way. It just kind of, in fact, appalls people increasingly, because they have to go to work, recite this religious mantra.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, it seems that there is like the critique of that is becoming pervasive. I mean,
yeah.
Well, when it comes to fascism, though, I mean, I know a lot of my listeners would start screaming at that definition of fascism, but that's another point. Like, I think that what we're seeing now is clearly, I know in interviews you alluded to it, where we're seeing a sort of weird form of like liberal totalitarianism that is unique in that it is still a form of millenarian thinking, but the mechanisms by which it enforces doctrine is quite different than, say, explicit fascism or explicit communism. There seems to be, and I think, Heidegger had a great point in that, like, what did he say? Like, his most controversial thing was either, the same thing that produced, well, for YouTube purposes, that one event in the 20th century in World War II is the same thing that produces the wheat thresher. But also, what did he say in Der Spiegel? Only a God can save us now. In other words, the framing of the human subject within very particular ideological confines, in the human as a resource, and I mean, you've alluded to this a lot in your work, is that we think of like, standing reserve and in framing as the human as the resource and the human as an ideological input-output mechanism, right? a particular abstract machine. But what's fascinating about your book is that when it comes to men in particular, it's almost like that standing reserve is being withered purposefully, which is like
Yeah.
you'd figure would defy the logic of like whatever you want to call it, capitalist realism. But it seems that like it's almost as if the following of particular human stock. I know as terrible as that language is, as a man especially, but it seems like that is a huge part of this current regime that we're seeing for a variety of reasons. So maybe like you could get into that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe we can come back to this question, the definition of fascism as well.
Right,
I mean,
right,
it's
right,
like, yeah, I mean, I'm in a sense being glib because of this kind of ironic reversal where it's like anyone who disagrees with the current regime is, designated a fascist, right? And it's like,
yeah.
I mean, obviously we're well aware of this now as a tactic. And it has nothing to do with historical fascism, either in theory or in practice.
Right, right.
I suppose, I'm working to my own set of definition to some degree in terms of, this question of homogeneity and institutionalization, and
Right.
there are different ways of saying the same thing, and you're referring to the kind of like the chewing up of human material or the kind of standing reserve idea. And I agree. I think there's a real sense in which the current regime, doesn't need men, and is kind of in a sense content to let them, rot, frankly, in many, particularly men of a lower economic state background. And we see this with the deaths of despair and the opioid crises and this kind of destruction of social roles, which also happened in Britain in the 1980s with the closure of industry and, just this kind of, systematic switch from a kind of masculinized to a feminized workplace,
Right.
And the celebration of a certain kind of feminine energy, even like, all of these institutions like HR and everything have become like, or the internet, they're extremely feminized in terms of how they operate, the level of backstabbing, like these kind of very negative aspects of feminine behavior, if you like, in group, out group, cliquiness, and so in a way, like men have become feminine in a bad sense as well. And, and like this is kind of a tragedy for everyone. So you get all these like women who've been encouraged to think that like, oh, being a high status woman is like getting a good job, getting a degree and living in a city and making money at some kind of media job or some, and and then goes on apps and is like disappointed by everything, and you end up in this kind of very eroded, like, I don't know, culture in which there's sort of nihilism, like just pouring out of everyone, and
Exactly. It really is like in terms of like it really is like an ideological bomb that has been, because like I get in your works there's a huge sense of like we are among the ruins, but well, sorry, I cut you off, Nina. Please finish your point. I'm sorry.
No, please interrupt me.
No, like there's a sense like we're among the ruins, like even like something as banal as the other day there was this TikTok that got spread around. My good friend Catherine D, default friend, she goes on TikTok like 4 hours a day. I don't know how, but there was this TikTok about this like project manager for some tech company, and there's like two of these, very attractive young women. The mid thing is we could get into that discourse, but like they were talking about like, well, we're project managers and we motivate the team and blah blah, and it's like anything other to do than tech. But the thing is like, it's the people who are like incredibly upset. Usual like, right-wing trad people in my circles. But then like the other response being is that, well, this is like, I mean, as much as you want to admit it or not, like this is sort of the way in which the workplace and academia and various institutions in society, they very much have, I mean, to use a meme term, they have like a very gynocratic in terms of, I would say, like, how shall I call it? The sort of the socialization and the operational ethos of the way in which these workplaces operate. It seems that it necessitates a certain form of uniquely feminine interaction and ways of doing things, which may not be conducive to like which, I mean, what's the greater evil? Like, is it that, or is it like, oh no, we should focus hard on tech, and it's like, it's got to be productive all the time. It's got to be autistically, productive. But then it's true though. I mean, when civilization has stagnated to such a point, it's like, well, maybe we should question, like, okay, yeah, whatever. It's great that women are accepting themselves, but at the same time, it's like, well, there are things coming down the pipeline in terms of the motions of history that, like, maybe, we should put the pause button on some things here. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we need to acknowledge like several things. I mean, one of which is that a mixed sex workplace is not good for anybody in the main. I think it doesn't work. It's I mean, it's sad because like lots of people used to meet their spouse at work, but now you have all of these extreme restrictions on, interacting, and men are quite rightly terrified of being reported to HR for any kind of minor transgression, or like retweeting a bad joke outside of work hours or whatever. I mean, it's just so everyone's in this state of terror, looking for microaggressions or whatever. So it's not going to happen there, and I think that it's kind of too complicated. I mean, Illich talks about this in his book on gender in 1982, which he got very, very cancelled for, and he says that basically, industrial modernity is the again, like making indifferent of sex. So like previously sex there were different spheres basically of behavior and tool use and that were related to men and women, and everybody understood this to such a degree that it was basically tacit in most cultures. It was just like men do this, women do that, and it was symbiotic and harmonic, and men and women would come together at particular points, usually in a ritualized way, to meet one another, and that you would have a much more community sense of like, who would make a good match, for example, let's say, if you wanted to match people up. Whereas now you have a kind of horrific combination of like, super autonomous liberal individualism, which is like actually very painful for most people.
Yes.
It's very hard to be, I always make this point, but like, to have to reinvent the moral wheel on your own is like actually extremely difficult for everybody. Like if you've got pre-existing sets of rules like communities, parishes, churches, and so on, it's actually like, we are relational in that sense. So, you have individualism combined with this like terror, paranoia, Stasi, panopticon state, like fear of even a minor transgression will get you denounced and like blacklisted or whatever, and no forgiveness, no atonement.
Church of no salvation.
No salvation. And so I think the workplace thing, I think we're coming to the end of a particular liberal image of the workplace. I think probably we'll end up like this, like most people will be online
in
on
our
home.
pods.
The laptop class, whereas the poor people will still be running around like delivering things to people, and like we saw in the pandemic, but just kind of sped up. And
do you think that when it comes to, I mean, you've experienced this first, I don't know if you want to get into this, but like you've experienced firsthand in academia, I mean, someone who was thinking of the PhD track, but then it's like, oh, well, I don't have that particular like personality for it, I guess you could say. Like that sort of, it seems that they're looking for a specific phenotype, but like you've experienced this firsthand in terms of like how you were quote unquote canceled, and how like it seems that a lot of your current work is motivated by this unchaining from a system that in some ways is decaying, but in the other ways I think still has enough perception of legitimacy and will to power to like sustain itself, at least for like maybe a decade or so. But like you were saying, I mean, it's like the way in which men and women socialize, like it seems that we're lacking the throwness of it. But when it comes to like what's so interesting though is that it's like this hyperliberal discourse that like comes from the political left. But when it comes to like, this remaining theory cells in academia, like, they still have the pretense of, when we finally achieve the revolution, when there's some kind of like, I don't know, strange Marxoid thing that happens to the West, that, all of a sudden the workplace is going to be this harmonious collectivist thing, and there's going to be camaraderie. But then that's like Soviet retread nostalgia. Like, So what do you make of like the picture of the contemporary left-wing politics? How do they mediate like extreme individualism that is necessitated by the current regime ideology, and like this lip service to older notions of like Marxism, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of delusional utopianism that is characteristic of the residual left, like the old left, right? And in a way that you know, delusional utopianism is what characterizes the left. Like, to be perfectly honest, you know, like the
Yeah.
revolution is just around the corner, and you know, everything is terrible now, but you know, one more push, comrade, and you know, so I think, yeah, and actually, I have to say, you know, knowing some of the old leftists in academia, I mean, the levels of cowardice on show by them are just like spectacular. I mean, like literally, they've all just retreated into their, you know, tenure positions, and they say nothing, they comment nothing on, you know, the sort of deranged collapse of everything.
Yeah.
And you know, the sort of destruction of reality. So I mean, I think, you know, what, as we've seen in like recent years, like, I mean, I got into academia when it was free. It was like the 90s. It was fun. It was interesting. It was exciting. People wanted to stay up all night and take drugs and drink and talk about
Riot Girl, the young British
you know,
artists, you know,
you know, whatever. Like, it was really cool, and that's why I wanted to stay in it. It gradually got less and less cool, and more restrictive, and more boring, and people were like ending up borrowing 50k in the UK to study. Everyone was anxious, everyone was depressed, no one could think, no one could talk, everyone was probably, you know, like just absolutely terrible. So I think, you know, it's clear that what a few of us have been doing is this post-academic, para-academic thing. And you're right that, like, in a way, we're still depending upon the gains or whatever, the status that we accrued, right? Like, as academics, which isn't going to be the same for people who are, you know, can't afford existentially or economically to borrow the sheer amount of money it would take to actually study. Like, I say, all of my degrees were free, literally, which is like kind of unthinkable for most people today, right? And it, you know, I am older than a lot of people I'm talking to, but it wasn't that long ago, you know.
Right.
And I think we could easily go back to a system where it was much more you know, how to put it, like, harder to get into university. There are fewer universities, but they actually had a higher standard. They weren't just churning out ideological pablum and, you know, the same old shit that everyone now has to repeat. But they were actually genuinely like places of higher learning, and that you had very strict entry requirements, and you took in a fewer people, but the state would pay for them, and it was for the good of all, you know, and not this debt. You know, essentially universities now are just like debt making machines, and they keep young people out of the workforce because there's no jobs for them, you know. And this is why you see this vicious competition between younger people who are like use anything to get ahead, including lying,
canceling each other.
Yeah, because they've been taught to be like vicious little Hobbesian. It's like, it's, in a way, it's not their fault. And I kind of want to say this thing about men and women. I was like, forgot to make this brief point before. It's like, one of the things I think we have to avoid, like, whatever our political position is, this kind of desire to blame the other sex. You know, I see a lot of it in right-wing circles where men are like, there's a kind of joking misogyny, but then there's sometimes a kind of like,
there's very real, like, female annihilationist discourse.
Right, there's sort of outright hatred in some quarters, whether it's on the basis of a bad experience with a woman and therefore, you know, and then a generalization. But I think, like, the superior position is really to recognize how this culture both men and women, you know, and that, like, one is not responsible for the other, right? I mean, we're talking about these kind of pathologies, like the negative feminine energy of the contemporary workplace, right? But that's bad for men and for women. Right. And the contemporary dating scene is bad for both men and women in different ways. Like, it's not like one group is kind of, you know, it's not like women are winning, like, although that can sometimes be seen.
That's often neglected in right-wing circles. I mean, I think there is some awareness, though. There are certain people, like, I mean, I know, but of course, you, like me, you get accused of being a simp, right? Like, I'm simping right now by having you on my podcast. So, but I think there is some awareness of the archetypal forces that are at work here. I think that I said this to Catherine, actually, surprising enough. I said, like, I said this to Alex Kashuda, that there's only like a narrow band of femininity that is celebrated, that there isn't like the full potential, even the way in which the image of the young girl is being commodified, that is like the eternal wellspring of youth, that the girl boss is both the eternal young woman and the crone and the other aspects of femininity that used to have a place in society. They're being displaced, like the mother,
Yeah.
for instance. And it seems that like that is often ignored in right-wing spaces, because I think like there's a hyper focus on this sort of like girl boss, like this sort of manosphere 2010s discourse is, I think that's slowly starting to like being questioned. Even like there's this really great documentarian I interviewed. His name is Crooner. He did this e-girl documentary series, and I think you'd love it, Nina. I'll send it to you. But we had on a previous episode of Content Minded, we were talking about how it's not that you like the mistake isn't you shouldn't conquer the feminine. It's that the feminine has to have a proper reawakening in some respects, and that the sort of like discourse around, like you mentioned in your book Hypergamy, for instance, like it's, you have to like realize that if man has a solidified nature, the feminine also has a nature that has to be contended with. And when I say nature, I do realize that a lot of it is constructed, at least to an extent. And constructed does not mean not real. It's the reality of being gendered beings, right? But it seems that like the extreme response by a lot of right-wing discourse, in like, I wouldn't even say particularly right-wing, because there's a lot of people in the manosphere that wouldn't identify with a lot of aspects of the right. But like in terms of like, let's say 2010s, anti-SJW manosphere, SJW discourse, it seems that a lot of those concepts are apt, but like the approach to it is kind of like equally unhealthy. Not unhealthy in like the media, like, oh my God, they're going to go out and do mass, YouTube purposes redacted. Like, I mean, it serves as a, having been in the manosphere for a long time, it does serve as like kind of a weird crab bucket for very bitter, disenfranchised men, which, I mean, that's terrible, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so like several things, it's a very interesting set of questions. Like, I don't know. So for example, I mean, desire is unfair, right? Like, it is true that there are some men who will never like date a woman or like come anywhere near like I don't know, a stable relationship or let alone a marriage, right? And this is an extremely disaffected position, and it's one that does indeed breed resentment. And in a sense, you could say quite rightly, that's completely understandable. Like, who doesn't want to be loved, right? Who doesn't want to, and so one solution to that is the kind of make yourself more alpha thing, right? It's like, well, you can actually,
it looks maxing.
Yeah, you can do, there are actually lots of things you can do. You can like improve your mind, you can read books, you can become, you can like get fit, there's this kind of boosterish thing, which I defend in the book. I said, like, what's wrong with being fit? Whatever, like, this is all good. I don't think there's something inherently like right wing about that, but although the liberal media are always keen to tell you that there is some link between gyms and nofap and anything that men do must somehow be right wing. Not necessarily. I mean, I think the other aspect of this is like the thing you touch on, which is to do with the kind of like the mythopoetic or the archetypal, and the fact that, like, as you say, the image of the woman is so reduced. It's extremely narrow. It's narrow for women too. I mean, the number of women who have issues with not fitting into that thing, you see that in the kind of transition of young women because they don't fit like a feminine, it's absolutely like tragic, and all the people, like when I was growing up, like there were tomboys, like I was a tomboy. Tomboys were cool, man. Like they didn't, and it wasn't that you thought like, oh, I must be a man because I don't like embrace every single aspect of Disney femininity. It was just like, no, like you do what you want. Like, and it was genuinely progressive, if we want to use that word, in the 90s. Like there was a moment where I think we were heading in the right direction, where it was kind of, nobody cares actually. Like it doesn't matter what you wear or what you're into. It's all good, basically. And it doesn't make you one thing or another. That said, I think at this juncture, like what makes more sense is to actually go back to these questions of essentialism, of like the mythopoetic, of the archetypal in the broadest sense for both men and women, right? Which is kind of like a pagan position, which is to do with like, even though we're in this kind of, you know, post-industrial nightmare world in which we're kind of segregated from nature, including our own nature, which is why people are going mental, is to nevertheless try to tap into that, which is obviously what people like Robert Bly and others were doing with the mythopoetic stuff. And I think if we have a mythopoetics of both men and women, or male and female, and that we embrace it at a sort of like cosmic level, almost like that we do understand, and you know, you can use psychedelics to reflect on these things, but you know, to really like drill down into this, like, you know, who or what we are, right? Like, what is our place in the universe and how we relate to one another. And, you know, again, even like you joked about the simp thing, but this is like, there are so many other ways of men and women relating, like as friends or whatever, that can't or shouldn't be reduced to these, like, I don't know, very internet meme type. So yeah, I'm very into all the things that we're not supposed to be into, like nature, you know, essence.
Essence especially is like, that's the big no, like that's
right. Yeah. You know, but I think that those are our defenses against this homogenizing, you know, mechanizing, you know, making same of everybody, you know, which is causing untold misery.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what I wanted to ask you though, now that we've touched upon it, and having like, well, with a kayfabe, having a lot of sympathies towards this particular category, I guess the incel question would be like, I guess this is what we're alluding to. I've written about it for many years now. I mean, I've had, you know, especially from my, you know, when I was in grad school, and I get a lot of heat for this in the political right, but I am a fastidious reader of Michel Foucault. And to me, I feel that the incel is a form of biopower, or at least very highly Oedipalized biopower, and that the incel serves a lot of different functions of like modern governmentality and the sort of fallowing of the man as a human resource. It seems like the incel on one end is an unruly aspect that resists particular forms of symbolic significance within our society, whether it comes to the aspect of sexuality. But on the other end, it's not the way in which in the political left you have various modes of quote unquote resistance to sexualization, which you alluded to, which is like the erasure of the tomboy through the F2M, whether it's asexuality, whether it's a weird sort of queer politics that resists sexuality. It seems like the incel, it's the unruly aspect of that, but at the same time, the incel is subject to a huge apparatus of biopolitical control, whether it's surveillance, whether it's a sort of placing of the subjectivity of young men, young white men in particular, into the category of like, you are X, Y, and Z. Because at the one end, sexual worth becomes like the mode by which you are accepted in society. But then if like, when you fail to achieve that, especially as a man, it seems like that becomes the metric of worth. But at the same time, you know, we gripe about sexualization, but people, as we are obsessed about sex, we're having less sex than ever, right? Statistically, I mean, so what do you make of like the incel, and we could talk about the femcel as well, but like, what do you think of like the incel as this like biopolitical entity now as a category?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting what you're saying. I think, yeah, I mean, I suppose
academics would say this is terrible, by the way, but you know.
No. I think you're right to think about it in these like kind of Foucauldian type categories. It's like, you know, I mean, we are talking about biopower really, and if you think about it at the level of sex and energy, and you know, this is why they wanted to call the no-fap movement some right-wing, you know, thing when it's not, but there's something kind of about the liberal agenda which somehow requires people to be in a permanent state of shame because they're using too much pornography, right? So it's like, you know, the liberal model of sex is like, pornography is great, you must watch porn, you know, and I think the the resistance to that on the part of quite a few men is very, very important and very revealing, because it's like it's a recognition of what libidinal energy is, in fact, you know, and that to refuse to enter into that kind of pact of shame, you know, is actually a very powerful move. So that there's the kind of question of like sexual energy. I think other cultures or previous cultures maybe had like obviously different ways of dealing with, let's say, men who were forcibly celibate or were I don't know, not going to get married for one reason or another. And we can talk about monasteries, and of course there are nunneries too, and you know there's
or they died in war.
Yeah, exactly, or war, right? So like these are like the solutions in heavily inverted commas, right, to these kind of questions. It's like not everyone you know will get to marry and reproduce, right? Like, and this is one of the main claims of men going their own way, who I mentioned in the book, you know, that actually they say that 60% of all men haven't reproduced, you know, which is kind of like an interesting claim, because they're including all of the, like the young men who've died in war and so on and so forth. And so actually, you know, and their starting point therefore is, well, you are like maybe more likely than not to not have a sexual partner and blah blah blah, you know, and then why not preemptively take the volcile position, as it were, like
right,
you know, to dignify the position you're in because you refuse the entire culture. But I think I mean this is the reason why I liked Alex Lee Moyer's film, like TFW No GF, because I think it was very sympathetic portrayal of the men that she spoke to, you know, and like it made me think of like in the monasteries when the men are copying out the manuscripts, this is like making memes. You know, like,
it's true though. It's true.
It's
as
like
an artist myself, I could appreciate that reference.
Yeah, but like it really occurred to me. I like recently I was thinking about, like, you know, you had all these men just like kind of copying out these beautiful images and these words. And it's
the
like,
Book of Kells,
this is what's happening, you know, like meme culture is just updated monk culture.
What's funny, like that film No GF, I think I know people, like I'm good friends with Barrett, who is a producer on that, and I think I will have Alex one day, because there are some issues I have with the film in terms of focusing on incels, and of course, I shouldn't even say it, because like I had a famous falling out with one particular person in that film, but no, I think that at the time when I watched it, to me I really liked it. I mean, maybe because for some weird reason I'm attracted to these like really maudlin and quiet Canadian North American indie films, and to me it reminded me of a lot of cinema that portrays life at the bottom, and very particularly North American underclass, semi-rural small towns. Like I love that. I love it. But, and so to me, I think the mood and the atmosphere, it's indicative of it. But when it comes to the actual question of the incel, I think that in some ways the film didn't grapple with that question so much. It was about a very particular slice of post 2016 frog Twitter, which in some ways doesn't depict the whole, like, you know, plethora of it. But
I'm sure, like, and I don't know enough about the details of the individual characters or whatever.
I unfortunately do, but
sure. I mean, I suppose just as a kind of critic, you know, I reviewed the film. I just thought, look, this is really important because it kind of humanizes this group, you know, these people men are representative or not, and also it points out the kind of economic question. It's like, no, these are people living in small towns with cool opportunities, like not very much access to jobs. And, you know, like it really gave this personal dimension to this group, which are otherwise generally dismissed and treated as like, you know, scum, basically, you know, like, and, you know, the new rule, like the rule of our liberal regime is like, you're allowed to hate people that you say hate. So it's like, okay, if you say that incels hate women, then you're allowed to hate incels. And in fact, you're allowed to do whatever you want to them, right?
Right. They're abandoned to the law. They become the Homo sapien.
Exactly. No,
I said that on stream once, and I was
you know. Right. And so, you know, like, and then ultimately it's like, well, if what the incel wants is to be loved, it's like, well, this is extremely human. I mean, like, really, we're going to say that that's a bad thing now, you know?
Yeah, I'm a human and I want to be loved. Yeah.
I know,
just like everybody else today. Yeah.
But look, I mean, I agree. Look, it's a serious, question. It's like, I mean, Welbeck deals with it in his novels. I mean, endlessly, right? This question of the unfairness of desire. It's a brutal problem that we don't have a solution to in the absence of monasteries, and look, you're not going to get women, if women start being compelled by the state to have relationships with men, this is also not what we want.
Statement. Well, some people.
I know some people want that, but I mean, you can't have it both ways. It's like if you have a highly educated population, right? Right. Women famously, like, the more you educate them, the less they want to do trad things, right? So my sort of, pagan Illichian solution is to really, like, roll back all of those things for everybody, for us to live in a more sustainable way in smaller communities in which we have much more care and protection for each other. And this kind of I don't know, the mechanism of the image, the kind of brutality of the fantasy. It's like most people for most of history would have married, like, the brothers or sisters of the family who lived down the road.
Yes.
They would not be marrying movie stars or fantasizing about having sex with who. Do you know what I mean? Like,
exactly. Yeah.
We are destroyed by these images, whether they're pornographic. I mean, to the extent that, like, the image of the girl has imprinted, or the woman has imprinted itself on loads of men in this pornographic way. They, like, it's such a powerful image, but it's so destructive. And it's nobody gets to the most beautiful person in the world, and yet this is what, like, everyone is sort of, like, being told by these images. It's like, it doesn't exist. Beauty is a curse. All of the fairy tales tell us this, right? Beauty is not something to want or desire. It's actually extremely dangerous for the person who is beautiful. And I've known some very beautiful people, and it's actually horrible for them.
Yeah.
They actually have, like, a terrible life because everybody wants them, but they don't know why. Honestly, it's so much better to be, like, average looking. And actually, you could do a lot. Like, people can, like, I always think, like, if men just, like, wear a shirt or something, like, or a suit or anything, honestly, women are so kind and so easily impressed.
I think really, maybe me being a fez wearer, that could be some quirky, esoteric way.
But exactly.
Is it working, Nina? Am I No, I'm kidding.
I think you're looking great. You look, like, very orthodox.
Yeah, I know, but I'm a Catholic. But maybe I don't know, the way the Catholic Church is going, maybe I got to.
Yeah, you could go to, like, Armenian or Russian Orthodox or something. Like, you need some, like, really hardcore robes.
Yeah, the monastery idea is fascinating. I had this controversial tweet once where I said that, people talk about the femcel, which, I mean, is an often, me and Default talk about this, but, like, it's an often neglected, I think, category, because the incel, the suffering of the incel, unfortunately, in a lot of cases not a lot, like a few cases, has been public. I mean, in the book you wrote about, 4chan we call Saint Eliot, right? Saint Eliot. Oh God, that's terrible. But it seems that, I had this tweet once about how the absence of the nunnery in the West, it tends to, like, all of these, like, let's say, unconventional women, they found a great community and a great longing. And, let's face it, I'm a Catholic, but, like, let's be honest, a lot of those women had a lot of issues in terms of their own sexuality as well. I mean, we all know about the lesbian nun thing. I mean, not to overblow it, but, like, it seems that unconventionality in terms of your own sexual identity, there were elements within society that helped mediate that very, like, female-centric, like, wholly run by women structure that nunneries provided, right, under the auspices of, various churches. And I know, like, Vatican II, like, there was a lot of, like, liberalization and a lot of less than, orthodox things that happened. But I think that, I remember Paglia talking about how the Rad Femmes of old, how they had the nun phase, right? The nunnery phase. It seems that there's a truth to that, in that there were options for all male or all female spaces back in the day that served a higher purpose in the absence of creating a productive family life. It was the service of God, service of nation, service of a people. But now it seems like even artists back in the day, and great scientists and philosophers, I mean, you have to realize, like, the grad departments were always like havens for femcels and incels back in the day, at least. But it seems that in the absence of this, like, what option is there? Because I know that women, I think the femcels are given some option that is terrible, ghastly. But people, like, the incel is given nothing almost, right? Like, they're given, besides pornography, besides various palliatives, which we can all, pornography, video games, other things, it seems like there isn't an option geared towards men who are disenfranchised by the modern, like, after the orgy society.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, how to put it, I mean, there are still monasteries and nunneries.
Oh, yes, of course.
Let's be clear. But I mean, I agree. We've kind of generally been forced into this mixed society, right? Like, we have no choice. I talk about this in the book. I think, there are only kind of really strategies for kind of getting along, which is what I propose. But rather than this kind of, buying into the hostility and the suspicion and the terror. But yeah, I mean, in terms of these kind of forms of segregation or separation, and we mean, I guess I mean that positively, potentially, I mean, you do have some interesting rad femme ideas from the 70s about separatism, where you would have kind of female only communes, sometimes guarded by guns, they really would be like female kind of only spaces. And they would actually, it's interesting, there's a kind of rad femme anti-Christian argument, by the way, which no one ever talks about, which is to say, like, it's life is good, like violence is bad, abortion is violence, men are violent, but it's not women's fault that they get pregnant, right? So let's bring up children collectively, as women, right? Like, that was actually a strong rad femme position that was on the side of nature and production and life and all of those things. But it's not a religious anti-abortion argument. It does have a kind of a sort of female claim to peace and nature and life and all.
There's ecofeminist ideas as well. There's Maria von Franz, for instance, comes to mind. If we're talking about
No, exactly. And like, people often forget that there's, this current iteration of feminism, it isn't feminism at all. It's some like liberal egregore, it's a monstrosity. It has nothing to do with women or like anything, it's just a kind of supplement to, this particular, moment in the regime. So I don't know, like this, I think we're coming back to this question of what to do with like men, and like how, and I guess one of my other slogans all the time is this idea, like, everybody deserves beauty, right? But not the beauty that we're sold. It's like to find beauty in nature, in the outside, in art, in literature, to cultivate oneself in this way, I think is also kind of, I don't know, it's some sort of necessity, if you like. And
it always was, yes, exactly.
It always was. But I think it's part of also this kind of moving away from this domination of sex, like, I think this sex negative turn is very interesting, and like, say people are having less sex, and I think there's a kind of increasing horror of the, like, the reality of sex in terms of bodies together. Like, we live in an increasingly disembodied way,
I wanted to touch upon that as well.
But I'm wondering if there's a way in which the kind of sex negativity, the kind of 60 years after the sexual revolution, like, it's obviously not been great in loads of ways for a lot of people, men and women. It's been very, very socially destructive. Like, this image of freedom as the freedom to f around is actually the freedom to be sort of, destroyed by your own.
And it seems that, like, in terms of social institutions, like, I know that on social media, like on Twitter, there's always algorithm manipulation. It must be worse on TikTok. There was this tweet that blew up the other day about, like, like, oh, actually, it's a good thing that that mass divorce is a thing, that women are liberated now, and that children growing up in broken homes, it's a good thing actually. Like, it seems like that argument to me, I mean, can we have not, like, it's the same thing with the abortion issue, which I guess I wanted to touch upon beauty, but I guess we'll go back to the beauty thing.
Mhm.
Because I have ideas about that, but let's tackle something I wrote in my notes, which is oh man, I don't know, this is just like some kind of academic rivalry here, but like, let's talk about like the work of people like Sophie Lewis that talk about, because if reproduction is coupled from sex, if the control of reproduction enables a certain freedom that women have, and that if men are becoming increasingly irrelevant, then like her book, which I mean, from my religious perspective, is ghastly, but like in terms of intellectual content, let's say that this is the way in which the sort of liberal regime is going towards questions of family life and reproduction. What do you make of like the full surrogacy now thing? Like, maybe it's a good thing that, like, because in terms of ancient times, up until recently, children kind of were raised in common by women in communities, and that men had a different tertiary role later on in the development of children historically, because by necessity, women had, very strict control over family life, believe it or, but nowadays it seems that in the absence of that, to go back to that in a very like inverted, terribly secular, terribly liberal, and almost, I would say, in her book, nihilistic way. I mean, it basically is what perennialists call the counter initiation, right? It's like taking the inverse of that. So what do you make of like the full surrogacy now thing? Like, yeah. And
Well,
she's
I
also
mean,
said a lot of sus things, but I'm not going to get into gossip, but yeah, go ahead.
no, I mean, I think she's taken a logical position and pushed it to its end. So in that sense, she's a bearer of the, particular, as you say, nihilistic or even satanic liberal direction, which is the total separation of, I don't know, mother from child, ultimately. So, the surrogacy in practice is rich people paying poor women to carry their child, which then the mother technically never sees again. I mean, this is horrible, right?
Right. And the idea of like children being held in common is sort of like deeply, I mean, anti-tradition in the most deepest sense, right? Like, I mean, children become a vector of collective social technology, in other words. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that's overplayed by people on the left who might be engaging in this form of kind of, what we described earlier, this sort of utopian delusion, right? Like, because sometimes, I mean, I read this excellent book by Ferdinand Mount recently, who was like one of Thatcher's scriptwriters, and he wrote this amazing book called The Subversive Family. And he suggests that actually the left is completely wrong about the idea that we used to live in a much more communistic way, and that somehow the nuclear family was invented by the Industrial Revolution. And, that story that we're very familiar with from a kind of, vulgar Marxist account of history. Right. He says it's just not true. He says that basically the overriding model for the vast majority of human history, he says it predates even like the ancient Greeks, it predates Christianity, is of more or less a man and a woman and their children together, right? Even where people then also lived in like smaller units, or, or
the ancient family was, the tribal unit.
But that actually the family, as we, the nuclear family, is not the invention of the Industrial Revolution. It's actually something that's far deeper in our nature, if you see what I mean, in terms of how we actually want to reproduce and be together. And that actually, when you start to try and communize children, like in the kibbutzim in Israel, it doesn't work. Yes,
that's right. Yeah.
It's actually very bad for people. People don't like it. They like their own children, right? Exactly. And there's probably good reasons for that, or they're annoyed by their own children, but at least they're their own children, So Mount makes this very interesting argument, which is to say that the family as such is subversive in the sense that it is a bastion of resistance against precisely any form of politics, whether it's coming from the left or the right, which tries to mobilize the family in the name of another ideology. So let's say, you need to create more children in order to build the nation, or you need to have more children in order to, I don't know, like defend the commune or whatever, like, so that the family itself becomes a source of protection and resistance also against ideology. And I think we see this in the kind of resistance to CRT in schools, to drag performances. We see it where families are pulling their kids out of school because during the lockdown they saw what was going on Zoom and Skype, and they were like, this is horrible, I'm taking my kid away from this. So I think we do see, and I wrote this piece for Compact recently, which is a defense of the family in this way. It's like, no, actually the family is subversive, the family is not normie, and now it actually protects us, also because it's the people who care about us and know us best, which is also what you're seeing eroded when you have teenagers spending all their time online, and they're being kind of groomed and manipulated into thinking that there's something else, and they are being explicitly wrenched away from their parents and are being taught to see their parents as the enemy.
Yes. In a sense, family life has always been a sort of way in which men find significance, because the other options that men have explored are both uniquely fascinating but also terrifying. When you have like a huge amount of young men that don't have a family life, that don't have children, I mean, what happens usually, like, not very good things happens in society after that. Like, I mean, now that the world is sort of like, whether you want to say, like you said this once, I remember, was it with Justin Murphy or was it with Jeffrey Schollenberger? Like you said, absolute, society is going into this absolute death drive, and that we're spiraling down the way of Thanatos. And it's true, though. It seems that, like, the fact that, like, a lot of antinatalist and, like, quasi-nihilistic ideas are being normalized, I understand, like, the impulse of someone like BAP to say we have to break out of this malaise, and the only way to do it isn't like this moral revival that doesn't work, which, I mean, I question that. I mean, I criticize him in that respect. But I think that, the other side, which is like this sort of weird, like, antinatalism and nihilism that's being normalized, especially among Zoomers, it seems that it's being inculcated within the cultural milieu that, like, oh yeah, life sucks, and like having kids, like, like this sort of like argument that, well, you shouldn't be forced to have kids, like, it seems that the approach to family life is becoming increasingly like the popification of the critique of family life is what I mean. I think that's, like, to me, disturbing. But
yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's kind of like centrist and banal, but it's like, well, if we do care about, like, what most people want and what they say they want, and actually, like, when people, I don't know, like, are maybe being turned away from what they really, I mean, this is a psychoanalytic question, right? Like, I agree, it's very, like, there's a dominant antinatalism, and you can use things like climate change or whatever to create a situation where it's like, oh no, people shouldn't be having children, like, there are too many of us, whatever, blah blah blah. These are very, very strong ideological pressures, and the most over socialized, to use Ted Kaczynski's words, people will hear that message and they will be like, right, okay, it's my responsibility not to have children, and so on. But that doesn't address individual desires or desires at a smaller level, right? Which may very well be like, no, I actually do want to get married and have children. And it's like, well, we should be, like, I speak to people who are 10, 15 years younger than me, and they're like, I can't afford to get married and have a family, and I'm like, that's absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
Like, how do we stop that from happening? Like, where people want something, but they can't do it because of this economic feeling, or the feeling that they can't do it because of this economic pressure. I don't know, like, but it just seems very, very wrong that you have people who really want to have families. I think families are good.
Yeah. It seems like the old leftist argument that it still crops up from time to time. I know, like, red tubers, they talk about in their various video essays with a lot of, like, bisexual lighting. It's like, I think Contrapoints had, it was Contrapoints, or was it Philosophy Tube, had this video about how, like, the thesis about the witch, like, the witches resisted capitalism, they resisted family life, they had a petition. So the argument that, the family, the bourgeois family was integral to the capitalist system because it created a new crop of workers and so forth. I think like that's being disturbed by the fact that like let's like okay, without getting into hot water here for you in particular, it seems that like Western, like particularly European family life has to be sort of like ablated for a variety of ideological reasons, but also it seems that the production of more people in, you know, North America, Europe, Japan, like that becomes complicated because of the capitalist system, but rather the solution is to import by any other like metric an indentured servitude slave class from the third world. That now the issue of reproduction of the capitalist system in terms of human stock, now that
Yeah.
can be solved by globalization. Even like, you know, even ghastly terrible solutions to particularly men of financial means, like the importing of like mail order brides from the third world, for instance, like that is another. Or like you mentioned surrogacy, right? Like that's a lot of poor third world women, you know, a lot of poor domestic women. Like it seems that the thesis that the family was integral to bourgeois capitalism, now that's gone. Now it's like, you know, globalization has filled the void, but that creates a number of other problems that, I mean, without getting into it, like us, the political right go about all the time in terms of demographics, but like it seems that like even, okay, bracketing the demographic argument of the political right, let's just say purely from a human perspective, the importation of like people from the third world to do menial labor, like that's like that to me doesn't seem like a very good social model for a variety of reasons, right?
No,
So
I mean,
yeah.
I agree. I'd say like this is just absolutely brutal for everyone. Like, you know, I like Simone Weil's argument in The Need for Roots, which
Yes,
is
yes,
about,
yes,
you
yes.
know, the importance of place and people, you know, and I think it's a mistake for the left to concede any ground on this, you know, that actually, you know, what we're talking about in terms of a relation to the land and to work and to origin and to
Yeah.
roots of all kinds is absolutely integral for our sense of who we are. And I think this kind of deracination for everybody, but particularly those people, and particularly people who are very highly skilled, who are also then being taken away from their own
Yeah, that's
countries.
another exactly, that's another
You know,
aspect.
I mean, this is horrific, right? So you
Yeah.
end up, you know, even in Eastern Europe, like I spent some time in Bosnia, and
Oh, really? Yeah.
What Germany does is basically just cream off, in fact, you know, give economic offers to all of the brightest people, young people in Bosnia. And they have special kind of, you know, visas and so on, and they just basically like asset strip, if you want to use that word, on
Yeah. Yeah.
human population of these countries because they're richer than others, you know. And this is like inhuman. It's bad for everybody. It creates like, you know, yeah, it leaves a lot of countries worse off in every respect because all of the skilled people have left, and doctors and everyone else. And also you have even from an HR point of view, right? Like, I don't know, like I speak to this woman who's from India, and she's like a beautician, and she was trained as a medical nurse in
Mm-hmm.
India. But
Mm-hmm.
here, the only job she can do is like waxing, you know, middle class women's legs, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you know, this is like, what is the point in that? Like, or taxi drivers who you meet who come from all over the world who are like, yeah, I used to be a
Engineers
university
and
lecturer or an engineer, and you're like,
yeah.
well, right, okay. Well, this is stupid. I mean, what a stupid system. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I agree, you know, global capitalism's solution to you know, needing more workers is simply the global free movement of people, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
which I think in practice doesn't help anybody, you know, is actually just devastating for everybody, but particularly for those people who are like economically coerced to sell their bodies in surrogacy or move countries and abandon their own
Yeah.
background.
But I had this thesis once I was on another podcast. I said like it's funny how a lot of these like decrepit boomer politicians, like I mean, they have a hatred of Russia for a variety of other reasons, but it seems like to me a big factor in like the support of the current conflict is because like a lot of like the sex tourism that happens in Eastern Europe and a lot of like the cam modeling and OnlyFans, it seems like the picture of like the incredibly hot blue and yellow country woman is motivating like boomer politicians to basically risk the possibility of World War III because of their own libidinal desires for the Slavic Eastern woman, mail order bride, slash cam girl. It's like, I don't know if that's true or not. That's a totally crazy thesis, but it seems like that's like a weird, like, you know, when we think of like in terms of like a certain order of like the political class, it's almost like there's a libidinization to global politics and conflict. I don't know if that, I know, Nina, that's a crazy thesis. I should have spared you from that one, but no.
No, I think, look, there is a way, and you know, you can read Lyotard and others on this, or even Giordano Bruno. Like, all politics is libido.
Exactly.
You know, and all politics is magic, because magic is the manipulation desire, right? So it's absolutely I don't know how to put it, like possible and not unlikely that these things play a role.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, you could say that, Nina. You could say that's totally crazy on my part. I wouldn't be offended. Don't worry about it.
No, but I think it is. But you know, like we're saying, look, I do think the image of the beautiful woman is like the image of our time. That's like kind of corrupting everybody, men and women alike. You know, whether it's confusing people about the object of their desire and they want to become this thing because they think this thing has all these other things, and you know, it's very bad black magic actually what's happening. And I do think probably you know, that this, I mean, you saw it in the Iraq War as well. It was like, oh, let's liberate these women because, you know, they're being oppressed and they're not free. You know, you had this kind of awful consumer feminism, which I critiqued in the first book, which was being used to promote war. You know, it's like saying, oh, we need to liberate these women so they can wear bikinis. Like,
look at what Iranian women were before, you know, the Ayatollah. Like, that's the boomer conservative. Yeah.
You know, and so I mean, so I do think these things are like relevant, for sure. And I don't know, it's bad magic.
No, it's true. But I wanted to I will bring up, I think, I don't know if you've heard this critique or not, but when it comes to the sort of the imago of the beautiful woman in terms of like quote unquote sex work, like that in itself is a problematic language, because the OnlyFans woman and like a woman on the streets doing prostitution, like that's like you can't get like a world more apart. Like, I think it's disingenuous to say that they're in the same thing. But like when it comes to the aspect of in popular media and in OnlyFans, it seems that like the response to the more 1990s critique of the beauty industry from people like Naomi Wolf, for instance, right? Like it seems that that's complicated now, because it's no longer like the pornographic image of the beautiful woman, but it's almost like now like this is like, again, going back to like the mid discourse, right? The mid thing is like interesting to me because it seems like there's less than conventionally attractive women who are doing this degree of like soft pornography and who are now becoming normalized. But the response to that is either, is it a good thing that these beauty standards are coming apart? Which, I mean, yeah, in some ways it is good. But then the option is like, well, now these things have enabled like ordinary women to do pornography, which is in itself another form of exploitation. So it's like, is the solution, is that really the solution? Is that we're going to like, and I know like some like, you know, manosphere people, like they call it pussy inflation, right? Like even less than conventionally attractive women are becoming attractive by virtue of like, you know, the sexual marketplace being distorted or whatever, right? But like, it seems like this, like, and the one end I do agree. I think that like beauty standards have been terrible for women, like, you know, when it comes to things like body image and anorexia and things like that. And now like, you know, the digital aspect of it is also complicated when it comes to like the e-girl, for instance. Like we can get into that. But what do you make of like now that unconventionally attractive women are also finding success within quote unquote sex work?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it actually links back to the kind of BAP question in a way, which is about the reinstatement of beauty and the fact that there are like, let's say, hard limits, or that there should be, and that you know, because You know, of course it's true, like from the Dove adverts to like Calvin Klein or whatever, like, you know, we are seeing the kind of increasing dominance of, you know, unconventional body types, which we are also supposed to think are beautiful and sexy, even when we don't, right?
Right,
Like right? Like most people don't find these women or men attractive, actually, and this is another hard truth, right? So then you're like, oh, why are these things being pushed? Why are these things being promoted? Is it in fact to get people used to the idea that they should be unfit and unhappy and miserable, and like that's the best they can accept? And, you know, because it's true, if you had a strong and healthy population, they wouldn't need like the medical industry, they wouldn't need to take antidepressants, they wouldn't need to, like, you know, they wouldn't eat bad food, they would, do you know what I mean? Like it's manifestly obvious that there's a way in which the system, you know, traps people within it, like, and presents back images of that might lower their expectations about themselves, for example, you know. And you could say this is an unhealthy culture. You know, Illich was talking about this, the medical industry in the early 1970s, right? The way in which it creates patients, and then it's iatrogenic because it needs to hurt people in order to keep them
again the basic Foucault 101 too as well, right? Yeah
You know, so you create, everyone is a kind of medicalized person in that sense. And yeah, so I know what you're saying. Like, it's kind of, I mean, obviously, like at this point, I don't think anyone should be watching pornography. I think OnlyFans is actually a deep state compromat project.
Whoa! Dropping the red pills, Nina. Yeah.
So because it was strange, like during lockdown, it was like, hey girls, you know, like it's not real sex work, it's just a bit of fun, you can make some money, you know. And like you get all these college age girls, and you know, you have universities that are like promoting sex work for students, and they're running like courses, and it's like arranged, it's, you know, and you're like, who benefits from this, right? It's not the 18-year-old girls who are like showing their breasts on camera, like, you know, this is actually potentially very dangerous for them later on, or whatever. Like, you know, you're giving away, even if you create a culture of zero shame, right? And you say, well, it doesn't matter, it's just a body, who cares, you know? Like you're never actually going to get there. You're going to get to a situation which we already have, which is like people using sexual images of other people in order to kind of have threats over them. And if you have that at the state level, you know, I mean, there's compromise on everyone for everything. Like, we've created our own files as well.
It's true.
You know, I'm very, very like against this, and you know, I agree that it's different in nature from sex work. But if you read people like Rachel Moran, she's just written a very, very good essay as someone who's a former and she says, look, prostitution is not the oldest industry in the world. It's a profession. Midwifery is the oldest profession in the world, and you know, which I think is important, just in that way that people have this fatalistic thing, like, oh, you know, prostitution must exist because it's always existed, blah blah blah, you know. And she also points out that, like, it's almost like we imagine a category of person, largely women but not only, who for some reason are not prey to all of the same feelings as other human beings, which is to say, like, that they somehow fancy everybody who has sex with them. No, they don't. No, right? God, no. That they don't have any boundaries to their body. Of course they do, you know. And we know about like the methods of dissociation and drug use and so on that are, you know. So
no, I was gonna say, it seems like when it comes to that, I mean, do you know that YouTube channel Soft White Underbelly? Have you heard about this? Well, he's a Mark, what's his name? Mark Lilla. He was a photographer that used to go into Skid Row and the Castro and other places in Philadelphia and San Francisco and so forth. And he has this YouTube channel that's very popular, gets millions of views, of people who are like in various states of like precarious and objection, or even like just weird, interesting people who have paraphilias. But a lot of like popular content is interviewing prostitutes, interviewing people who are in both female and male sex work of various kinds. And it seems, though, that there is that need to, it's almost like, I mean, I know voyeurism and exploitation as a genre of film and documentary has always been, like, it's perennial. But it seems nowadays people are very, like, hungry for this almost, like, I would say, emotional asthma in a way, you know, emotional ASMR. It seems like to hear the story of people at the bottom, now that in itself becomes a mode of like weird enjoyment for people, which is kind of very, I don't know about that, if that's responsible or not. Like it's vital in terms of understanding what people's experiences are like, especially like some of the horrific stories of these sex workers, like that they go into vivid detail, a lot of them. But I'm wondering, like, I don't know if like that's actually good, if that's like just gratuitousness. I mean, yeah, like you,
Yeah,
yeah, you know.
it's a very interesting question. It's like the desire for the vicarious horror of the life of the other. And I don't know. I mean,
Yes, yeah, exactly.
already in the 1990s, like there was this definite push towards the misery memoir, whether they were true or false, right? And a lot of
Yes.
them turned out to be like bullshit. But you would have like chat shows like Oprah Winfrey and what was my favorite one? What's the other one? The sort of like working class white woman. Like they
Oh,
just have like,
Janet Lake, or what was her name?
no, it was like I don't know. She had like this very sort of faux empathetic face, and it was all like, oh no, tell me about your story. Ricky
Ellen
Lake.
DeGeneres. What's her?
Oh, Ricky Lake.
Ricky Lake, yeah, Ricky Lake, yeah.
Ricky Lake, and they would always have these like
Yeah.
absolutely terrible stories of like someone having the worst possible life, and and like I say, like I'm sure most of them were like made up or at least exaggerated, and
Yeah.
but there's always been, I think, probably in also Victorian times, stories of fallen women, and like people do love this, like I think because it reminds them that like they're not in that position.
Yeah,
right? But it is a form of moral pornography, right? Like it is
moral pornography, exactly. Yeah, it's moral harassment.
It's like, because it's true that basically anybody can fall, like anybody can lose their position, anybody can get fucked up on drugs, anybody could, like, I don't know, have a series of terrible things happen to them, and then they end up, so I think that there's like that vicarious enjoyment of not being that person. It's a kind of weird inverted scapegoat thing. But as to whether we should encourage it, I don't know. It's like this very difficult, very tricky question, and like also there seems to be less and less role today for fiction in some sense. People want the autofiction, they want the autobiography, they want the
the confessional article, the 2010s confessional article. Yeah,
more than like the story, more than the fiction, and there's a kind of like war, a literal war on the imagination, I think. Like all novels now are read for their political dogmatism, not whether they conform to the ideology, not because they're exercises in imagination, right? And the same for pornography. My ultimate critique of pornography is that it destroys the imagination. You're filled with other images.
You literally
of other people.
Yeah, people are saying, oh, did I cut you off, Nina? I'm very sorry.
No, I'm like, just to say, like pornography, like you're just flooding your own capacity to fantasize and to imagine with other people's images.
Exactly. No, but it's true. Like a lot of men that I know, even, like it's very common if you look at like Reddit confessional subreddits or whatever, like, when you're a young boy and you hit sexual puberty and like you see women you like in your class or whatever, what do? You jerk off to them, right? Like you imagine them. But as time goes on, as you're more and more imbibing in pornography, the capacity to quote unquote get off just by the pure sense of imagination, you can't do that anymore. It's impossible. You need that sexual stimulus. And I think like that's a very fascinating development among like millennial and Zoomer young men, right? Like,
but this really is a slippery slope, right? And you hear men talk about the fact that they need harder and harder stuff to get off, like stuff that's more violent, and they end up to like watching images of abuse and like, crossing a line in order, like really viciously, in order to like get the same hit, right? And this is one of the problems. If you start doing this, like this is sometimes where it ends. And like we don't really have a culture of restraint or limits. We have one that says if it feels good, you should do it because your desire is good.
Yes.
And it's not. Like love is not always love. Desire is not always good. Most of the time it's bad for you. Like most of the things you want to do are bad for you.
It's true.
I speak as someone who's like constitutively incapable of like not doing things that are bad for me, like everybody. But like I've been an addict. It's like I know what it's like to be enthralled to something that is destroying you and your life. And many people have an experience of this, whether it's pornography, substances, alcohol, whatever. Like, we live in a culture that does not encourage the preemptive recognition of limits,
Exactly. And I think to me it's very interesting, like we were talking about the beauty thing. My thesis is that when it comes to like quote unquote unconventional women getting into sex work, OnlyFans, having a parasocial relationship with their simps and pay pigs, I think I mean we laugh, but it's true. I think that the reason why it's because it's the illusion of attainability is even more pervasive than like what pornography used to be. Like, because there was this time in the early 2000s, I remember, where like pornography was still seen as like edgy and subversive, but
Mhm.
then it was normalized in culture. There was this weird intersect, maybe just me as like particular millennial, 2000, late 90s 2000s kid, but it was like porn stars were in like had like started cropping up in video game culture,
Mhm.
professional wrestling, metal music. Like it seemed like pornography was still on the cutting edge of like male edginess. But now it seems like pornography, like through 2010 sex posi feminism, it seems like pornography and the illusion of the attainable mid girl, now it's like almost female coded and like female, like it plays to the desires of feminine liberation as opposed to the desires of like, you know, horny, aggressive young men playing video games, watching MMA. I don't know, but like, there still is that though. There still is that. But now that porn has become ubiquitous, it seems like young women in there, it's not that their desires are being played to, because porn still is very like male centric in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, but like their desires are almost dictated to. Like it's like you must be this person engaged in like, being a sponge for very particular forms of male attention. But then it's like they say that they don't want that attention. I mean, who wants like a bunch of
No,
like,
they
yeah,
want the money.
yeah, exactly, exactly,
No, I mean,
yeah,
let's be clear. Like, I think women don't respond to pornography in the same way as men. They're not
right,
visually
right,
motivated in the same way. I think this is an essential truth
mm-hmm.
fundamentally, that women are more interested in narrative and they're more interested in forms of proximity and intimacy. So, like, the
Right,
virtual cam girl thing is very useful for women who don't actually want to engage in bodily contact with undesirable men.
right,
And it also means they can make money. And if you say, well, oh, it's just as moral to make money showing your breasts on camera as it is to like work in a nursing home, then why wouldn't you?
right,
It's easier.
right.
You can do it from home. You blah blah blah. You don't have to deal with other people. You don't have to do like,
It's like being a
So
podcaster.
yeah. I mean, we're all prudes, as the pop group said
Exactly.
decades ago. So in that sense, it makes sense. Like, it doesn't cost you that much. You can make a lot of money, and um yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just because something's possible doesn't make it right, of course, right?
Yeah,
As
yeah.
Jurassic Park taught us. But like, I don't know what to say about it really. It's just I think this point about the attainable or almost attainable like girl next door, I think there is something. It's like really tragic in a way. It's like saying even the kind of woman that you might have expected to marry in the
Yes.
1950s or 60s, you have to pay for now. Like,
Oh my God. Yes. Oh, oh man. We're
no, but this is like awful for women too, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's like,
yeah. That's
no,
right.
no. I
That's
mean,
right. Yeah.
I agree that they have an advantage in this environment in some ways, right?
Right, right.
But ultimately, for women to sell themselves and to be nihilistic, to be single, to think that that's what freedom is,
Right, right.
it's also really, really damaging for women. And like, you are going to see increasing numbers of women in their late 30s going, oh shit, like,
It's already happening actually with older millennial women. I mean, it's
right.
starting like you had this chapter in One Dimensional Woman. Um, like for example, your good friend is also a good friend of mine, Daniel Miller, and
Mm.
Daniel Miller has immensely helped me out as well. And I want to get him on the show. Maybe if you could put in a good word for me. Uh, he's such a fascinating writer and
Mhm.
artist, and like, yeah, that's, I know that you were viciously critiqued because very bad faith people are like, "Ooh, why are you talking to a fascist?" Like, I'm
Yeah,
sure you're probably gonna get, like, and never mind, don't worry about it.
but you know, like you say, I won't be nearly right wing enough for your listeners, right?
No,
Like,
but my listeners love you though. Like, I mention you quite a bit, actually.
no, but it's really like bizarre. It's like, where do you find yourself? It's like, half the people are calling you a neo-Nazi, and the other half are like, well, she's a like liberal, and you're like, hell. Like,
people say I'm insufficiently enough, but that's the problem. Book, One-Dimensional Woman. What are you doing? You're doing a very feminine exploitation activity right now, Nina, putting on lipstick. I can't believe you. Can't believe you betrayed the sisterhood. You betrayed the matriarchy.
It doesn't even make me look better. I think I actually just do it as a kind of like,
Nina, you have a natural beauty that it lowers yourself to even put on lipstick. It's
God.
like defacing a statue of Ishtar. Okay.
I love this feminist geo. It's like,
yeah. Oh my God, I'm getting so viciously canceled by right-wing Twitter. They're already suspicious of me enough, but no.
You're like a 70s Rad Femme, man. You're like, no plastic surgery. Like,
I mean, even like, I find boob jobs abominable, in my opinion. I think that's terrible. Like, it's, oh man, but they're just not even appealing. But anyways, I bring up the point because in One-Dimensional Woman, which I really, One-Dimensional Man, I think, is probably the book that I would like. I mean, as much as I have a lot of sympathies towards Frankfurt thinking in terms of Adorno and Horkheimer, Marcuse, when it comes to One-Dimensional Man, I do think is very important. I mean, Eros and Civilization I have a lot of problems with, but like One-Dimensional Woman, there was this one chapter you said, you're like an advert for yourself, where you talk about, quote, from the boardroom to the strip club, one must capitalize on one's assets at every moment, demonstrating the one is indeed a good worker, a motivational employee, and that nothing prevents you from full immersion in the glorious world of work. And so even back then you were talking about the female coded nature of the workplace, but like you were saying, deeper than just our relation to the feminine in relation to the world of labor. But labor is important, of course, especially if you're a Marxist, right? But I think deeper than that, what you're saying is that the woman always has to be on, in terms of even when the distinction between work and pleasure, which like OnlyFans supposedly is, but we all know it's not. But let's say like the implosion of the feminine as an object of desire is everywhere, is in the workplace, is in social circles. The woman, even unconventionally attractive women, are now being granted this like aura of commodified beauty, which, I mean, what is it like as a man? I guess I can't understand as like a conventionally unattractive man. Like, I can't, what is it like to be always on? Like, it seems women in particular, but men have to always be on in a different way. But it seems like as society becomes more female coded, this like woman always experiencing the performativity of their own gender, it seems like that is becoming like the main thing now. Like, what is it? But experientially, what is that like,
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to go back to that book. I mean, you're like an advert for yourself, by the way. You just mentioned Daniel. Is a line I once said to Daniel when we were friends a long time ago, because he was like dressing up in this way, and I just thought it was a very funny line. But I think, I was trying to say that like this kind of, almost like the sexualization of the workplace. It's like no longer do you need to look good and perform for your boyfriend or potential husband. It's like you now it's everywhere. Like you said, it's like you do it for your employer, and like at this time I was working a lot of these kind of agency jobs. Where as I was a part-time master's student, and I was working in the Midlands, and I was just doing these jobs where you basically work somewhere for a week or 2 weeks, and you have to kind of, part of the whole thing is like being like, superficially or performatively like friendly to everybody, but no one will remembering your name because you'll be gone soon, and so you kind of don't really count as an employee, you know.
Yeah.
And it was a really horrible like set of experiences that like a lot of people had, right? And I was very like resentful of this work, and I was like, oh, I must try and understand what's going on here. But I do, yeah, I think the generalization of this thing about being, well, you said like existentially on in a particular way, like the feminine, and you know, and we could say, well, symptomatically then it's not surprising that a lot of young women in particular don't want to play that role, or they preemptively try to escape, and sadly not through tomboyism, which was the great escape that was very fun, and like I talk about in the beginning of the Man book in the 90s, you know, you had this idea of the ladette.
Yes.
And it was, of course, it was like hedonistic and like bad in some ways, like, you know, lots of people, it was like men and women together, like being friends, and everyone was being quite laddie and drinking too much, and it was like the era of rave and before the internet really got going, so there wasn't this kind of surveillance thing and whatnot, and there was a kind of equality in that, like it was the equality of the debauched or something, I describe it.
Oh, but yes.
But it did permit like a range of behaviors for like men and women, and it didn't involve depression and surgery and, you know, identity, right? It was just like, we're all here together, we're all gonna have fun, it's like a nice time, you know. And that's one way of dealing with the increasing proximity of men and women, is to like, well, let's have a party.
It seems like in this era there was like in youth culture that crossed over into the art world, like with punk, Riot Girl, grunge was a big one, because now men and women like physically look the same.
Yeah, I was really very into grunge. I wore like check shirt and like whatever, like moleskin trousers and Doc Martens, and everybody wore the same thing.
Who was your favorite? Oh, I'm not gonna. It's your favorite band, Pearl Jam, right?
Of course it was. How could you possibly guess?
Pearl Jam was for the girls. Alice in Chains was for the men.
I really liked Alice in Chains too, but I like the heavy instrumental ones, like the Jar of Flies.
Yeah, Jar of Flies, like, and Sap and
exactly. I like those ones. But yeah, my brother was very into like Machine Head and Alice in Chains. And...
yeah, I was a nu metal kid back in the day. Still am.
No, but I did like Pearl Jam. I'm sorry, it's true. They were like.
I knew it. Oh boy, I've retained my sexism. Anyways.